Following up from my last video on how to UV map anything in 5 simple steps, I put together this video that condenses down all of the main tips that I use when UV mapping. I'm not even sure how many tips I'm at now. I started at 5 and I got way more, but I'm gonna try to blitz through these so you can get the most amount in a short amount of time. So let's jump right to it. Alright, starting off is that you can create UV shells based off face selections. So let's isolate with Control 1 and zoom in with F. And then we're going to go into face selection mode. I can hold Tab while left click dragging to kind of add all of these faces to my selection. And then I can hit Control period to grow that selection. So now I've created this face selection. Then what I can do is go into the UV editor, Shift right mouse button and create UV shell. And just like that, I've created a UV shell based off my face selection, which sometimes is a little bit nicer than selecting your seams. So if I do that again, select these faces, Control period, grow those face selections. I can select these caps, Shift right mouse button, create shell, select all these UVs here, Shift right mouse button, unfold. This is really important and needs its own tip, but you can unfold along a specific UV axis. So if I rotate this downwards kind of 90 degrees or parallel with the U, so U is horizontal and V is vertical, I can unfold along U and then unfold along V, and then I can straighten my UVs and boom. Now I always make sure to do unfold along U and V just because sometimes it just gets a lot of that extra curvature out of the UV mapping and sometimes you don't need it. But I do it anyways because it only takes a couple of clicks. Jumping to our next tip, you may have always noticed me when I demo UV mapping that I'm using a nice clean mesh for Sub-D. But what if you have a optimized model like this? So let's take the cylinder of this revolver, hit Control 1 to isolate, and let's say now we want to UV map this. Well, for example, if I do camera based to reset these UVs, and I want to start selecting all of these edges here, we run into this challenge of being able to select edge loops, right? So there is a method that you can use to select through triangles, which is called continuous edges. So I can select my edge, and actually I like this. This example worked well. You can see where it stops from all these triangles here. Now if I hold Control right mouse button, you can go to 2 edges and then 2 continuous edges, and boom, it selects the continuous edges here. And I can continue to do that. And sometimes it works well and sometimes it doesn't. You can see kind of over selected here, which is fine. That allows me to select edges through triangles when you don't have clean or easy quads to double click your edges. Now, this next tip is even better and probably one of my favorites. And this is one that I got from Blender. Blender has this really nice feature that you can select sharp edges. Now by default, Maya doesn't have a select by sharp edges, but what I ended up using was just using ChatGPT and a little bit of Python scripting to create a simple script that will select my edges depending on the angle. So I have this here under my custom tab. I will select this cylinder and go to the top where it says sharp edges. So I just save the script. I type in my angle threshold, which is 35, give it a second, and there you go. It selects the sharp edges, which is great. This is exactly what I want. And it selects all these through. So now all I need to do is just for these cylindrical objects, if you've watched my last videos, I won't unwrap or unfold properly. And there we go. I think I missed one here. That should be everything. And then now I can cut, go back to my UV editing or my UV toolkit and do an unfold. And there you go. Now, if we do a quick layout, you can see everything unfolded nicely. However, there were some issues here with how it unfolded the main cylinder. So in order to fix that, we just need to add in one more edge. I would say probably on the bottom, but it is going to rotate, so it really doesn't matter. And I can select this like so and cut that. And then now we do an unfold, we do an orient, and then we do a layout, and there you go. Everything works together really nicely. And I unwrapped this rather complex model with a ton of different seams in just a few clicks. Huge time saver. Now, if you're interested in either the AGL or the stylized gun or these scripts, you can find all of these source files right on my Patreon, so be sure to check that out. All right, the next one is the Arrange and Layout panel. A lot of students don't use this on their first UV mapping, but there are a ton of good features in there. For example, if I have a bunch of common objects, and let's say I want to just stack all of them and have them overlapping, well, you can select all of your objects, go to Stack Similar, and boom. Even though they're both cylindrical, it still will stack them based off size and what's similar, which is super nice. That way, if you're trying to do game optimized textures, you'll only need to texture one without having them take up more UV space. Speaking of copying UVs, that brings us to our next tip. For example, if I jump here, let's take these 2 screws here, and I give this a specific UV set. So now I just change this. I'm going to cut and unfold this, and now it's completely different than the other one. But for example, if you watch my mastering UV mapping, you'll see that I had like 20 to 50 screws in there. And I only wanted to unwrap one and then copy those and transfer those attributes. Well, an easy way to do that is just using what's called transfer attributes inside of Maya. So select the object that you have UV mapped that you want to apply to the other object. In this case, this is what I want to apply to this object. So I select the first screw, then the second screw, then go to Mesh and open up the transfer attributes settings. These are the settings that you're going to want to use. Really, if I reset settings, the only thing that I really change is component. So if you enable component with these objects selected, let's see what it does, and simply hit apply. Boom, there you go. It copies the UV from the first object to the second, assuming these are exactly the same, and I mean vert for vert, edge for edge. So as long as they're the same, you're good to go. Now, keep in mind, transfer attributes only works when you're copying from one object to one other, but I found the script online that I'll link down below, shout out to the author, that'll allow you to copy the UVs to a bunch of different objects. So you just UV map one, transfer attributes to 100, and you're good to go. Now here's another question that I get a lot is, well, if I'm creating a subd model and I unwrap it, do I unwrap the subdivided mesh? Well, let's see what happens. Let's grab this lower piece of the gun, Control-1 to isolate, and I'll just do a quick unwrap using the workflow from my last video. Perfect, now I have this UV map, but what if I now look at this in checkered view, and if I hit 3 for smooth preview, and then I apply a mesh smooth, we can see what's happening is that the mesh is subdividing, but the UVs aren't. And even if I go into and make sure that smooth UVs are turned on, so you can see what happens when they're not, you can see that not smoothing the UVs isn't really having an effect on the model. So what I end up doing is just unwrap the base mesh, subdivide, and then go back to my UV toolkit and just simply unfold again, and there you go. Your seams are already there, they're already carrying through, and then now everything's looking good and we have no distortion. So the workflow for using subd models is UV map your base mesh, subdivide, and if it's causing issues, then just unfold your high poly. Now another tip that happens often is you get this, or you're like, oh shoot, I overcut my seam. Well, you don't have to worry about re-unfolding. Quick interruption. If you've clicked on this video, you're probably interested in 3D modeling and topology. So I'm excited to announce that I'm putting together a 3D modeling topology masterclass. Whether you're a beginner or an advanced user, this is going to help improve your skills in 3D modeling. This is just the first course, and trust me, you're in good hands. I'm an industry professional and I've been teaching for over 15 years. And I have some of the most popular topology videos on my YouTube. And this is going to be one of the first of many courses on my platform. I will be covering the entire 3D art pipeline, starting with modeling all the way through rendering for both offline and real-time rendering. So stay tuned and be sure to check out my Patreon for early access information. So I'll see you there. Now another tip that happens often is you get this, or you're like, oh shoot, I overcut my seam. Well, you don't have to worry about re-unfolding and whatnot. You can simply go in here, select the edge. Like you can just select the single edge. That's a problem. And back in the UV editor, you can just stitch together. Not a lot of people know that you can always just stitch together. Again, it's kind of right here under cut and sew. And then you may need to kind of re-unfold if it skews your UVs, but that's no big deal. If you re-unfold, that fixes that. So you can always stitch together that way. And then, you know, if you're sometimes you can see kind of shared vertices, or excuse me, shared seams here, and you do a stitch together, it'll kind of move it. You can tell it which one to do, A to B, B to A, whichever one that you've selected first. You could also just straight up use sew. I should find this one here. We can do sew, and you can see that one's typically you want to use when they're really close to each other. Otherwise it's going to leave the shells in place and then drag the seams there. Great, so another thing that I like to use, another tip constantly is, let's say you have your entire UV map set up and all of a sudden you had to change a part, but everything's textured. Let's say a late change, you want to texture it, you want to add it back to your texture set or your UV set. Well, the way to make sure that it's the exact scale that it should be, or I should say based off of Texel density, is let's say I grab these pieces here and I'll hold Control-1 to isolate, and let's just move these pieces up. And if I look at the checker, you can see that they're pretty close in size. But if I wanted to change the size of these to have one match the other, it's called matching Texel density. So if I go to transform, let's say I like this one here so you can kind of see what's going on. I like this. I want to match this Texel density to this. Well, you select your object that you want to get the Texel density of, go to your transform tab, scroll down a little bit and do get. You can see that I have get, which is like set to 48. And then if I select my other object, now I want to set. And now you can see the Texel density is the same. Maybe I should have did it the other way around. So for example, since this is a little bit bigger, I'll get this object and then I'll set this. Either way, it works perfectly fine. So now I can combine these on the same UV set and it has the exact same Texel density. Okay, and the last tip is using a feature called Unitize to be able to UV map curvy or spirally objects. I have an entire video on this, so you can check that out for further detail, but I wanted to make sure to just give a quick recap on how to do that. The most troublesome piece here is the spring. So if I select this mesh, press Ctrl+1 to isolate. The first thing I want to do with objects typically like this is I will separate the caps. So let's separate these caps here, and I can always add them back after. So Control- to grow selection, Shift right click and extract. So I've now separated these into a separate mesh. I will, of course, select this object, and remember, we've created history now. So if you're UV mapping, delete your history. With this object selected, let's jump over to our UV toolkit, go to Modify, Unitize. Now what this has done is it has taken every single face here and laid it flat on the 1-to-1 UV coordinate system. So if you look at the checker, it's going to look a little crazy, but each face is flat. Then I want to select the edge that is going to act as our seam. So I'll select this edge that runs on the inside. It really doesn't matter because it spirals to the outside anyways. Then in the UV editor, convert your selection to UV. So Control right click, 2 UVs. Then you want to select the invert. So you want to select everything else but this edge that is behaving as our seam. So now we hold Shift, marquee select, then you stitch together. And give this a second. This may take a few minutes or a few seconds.
3 days later.
Okay, and it finally finished. This one actually took it quite a while, but if I zoom out now, you can see that it actually UV mapped everything completely straight, which is awesome. Now, what you'll notice is, remember what the white borders are. The white borders are unstitched edges. So if I go to edge mode and just zoom out just enough, so you want to select all of these edges that are running straight up and down. So we can do that by selecting just marquee select until you just get that marquee selection right over it. And then I will Control to remove selection and then just hit stitch together.
The following Thursday.
Okay, and that took it a while, but to stitch together now, stitch together all of those seams. And then now you can see it's still pretty huge. Like if I put the checkerboard on there, it's massive. So I like to use Normalize, which is under Align and Snap. So if you do Normalize, it'll just bring it all the way back down to the UV space. So these could be kind of separate tips, but you can see that this is like way off here. If you want to put this way back to like the origin of the U and V, if you go to transform, you can see that this is 90U in negative and then like -8.5. But anyways, you can just set these to 0, 0. And if I hit F now, there we go. We're back now towards the 0, 0, or I should say 0, 1 of the UV coordinate system. And then there we go. This gives us a nice way to approach pretty complex objects. And again, I have a whole video that shows how to do this for roads, for pipes, and curvy objects. It's a little bit older, but it's the exact same workflow, I can promise you that. And a lot of people ask me where I get these UV checkers from. Well, you can go to uvchecker.vinzi.xyz, and it's a great place to create your own custom UV checker maps. So these are perfect to make your portfolio stand out, and they're really appealing to look at. Okay, that about wraps it up. I wanted to create this video to kind of condense a lot of the tips that I use for UV mapping. I hope you found this helpful. And again, if you want access to these source files, these scripts, or just to support the channel, be sure to check out my Patreon. And don't forget to check out my Discord if you've got more questions. We got a ton of talented artists that are well experienced and brand new. So it's a community that's growing to help us all get better. So with that, I'll see you around.